So perspective in space. We'll talk about some of the ways that we can use perspective to basically show space and depth. So effectively, there's two types of perspective, linear and nonlinear, which will make a little bit more sense if you don't know already as we go through our slides here. So examples of nonlinear perspective. It's basically a method of showing depth using position, overlapping, size, variation, color, value, etc. So you're not using essentially lines. Like linear perspective, a good example of linear would be drawing with like 1 point perspective, or if you had a photograph of a city street and you're effectively in the middle of the city street and all the lines of the buildings are essentially pointing towards like one vanishing point, that will be linear perspective. You can also show perspective in a nonlinear way like this with these various different methods. So we can see in some of these objects here, the images that are a little bit closer are a little bit, or rather the objects that are a little bit closer are kind of out of focus. And so as they focus going towards the back-ish or the left of the photo, they show you that use of space, right? The overlapping, where some of these leaves overlap this stem, so it shows space via position, overlapping, etc. So it starts to show some depth or perspective by overlapping, right? Some other ways we can do it: vertical positioning, overlapping, size variations, color and value. There's more, but these are like the basics, and we'll go through examples of all of these. Overlapping, it's as simple as when one object overlaps another, it looks closer, right? So in the case of these leaves, the leaves on the top, this one specifically, the leaves on the top appear closer in the image, where the leaf, like a leaf here underneath, is behind a few leaves. It looks like it's further back, right? There's also some tone and some color variations happening here to help it along, but this is the basics of overlapping, right? So when an object is on top of another object, it appears closer in your frame, right? Transparency, we can work with transparency to show perspective. We've sort of talked about this a little bit. We've mentioned, or we've, I don't know, leaned towards it, I guess, earlier on with our line work when we were talking about contour lines, things like that. Like, how do we show depth in an object, right? How do we show form? So if we go way back and we think about that one contour drawing that was like the various objects, that was like the spray bottle and the football and something else, even though those were just contour lines, they still overlapped. They didn't show the transparency, but if that spray bottle did have transparency, you would see something like this. So you have where these colors mix here. You can tell that these two glass bottles are on top or in front of the blue and the red glass bottle, and then the transparency with that overlapping emphasizes depth. And even where this sort of like corkscrew-ish element, whatever you would call that, on the neck of the bottles, the transparency changes as it goes in front and behind the neck, right? So we can use overlapping and transparency to emphasize depth. Size and position, specifically in this case, vertical position. So placing an object higher on the page has a tendency to make it look like it drops further back. Again, we have a couple elements going on here. We have some tone variations, but even if these were all the same tone, right, just by dropping them, or not dropping them, moving them up in the vertical plane a little bit, vertical positioning, helps these trees to sort of drop back into the distance. Again, there's some tone variations, there's some size variations that help along with it. But vertical positioning, so effectively placing an object higher on a page can make it look further back than objects placed lower. So even if these are all the same size and same tone, again, the trees higher up would have a tendency, your eye would push them back visually. Size variations, so to go along with the size and position. So smaller objects will look a little bit further away in the distance. Larger objects look closer. So we have the larger tree, the smaller tree, also vertically higher, so it looks like it's being pushed back into the plane. And then again, a little bit of tone, which we'll go into later. The tone also drops out a little bit, and that helps push it back into the distance, right? Value and detail, kind of building off the last slide. You can emphasize depth and space with value and detail. So we'll talk about detail first. So the ship coming into this harbor here, you can see pretty much on the left side, there's a lot of detail in the ship. There's a little bit more detail with the people on the ice helping the ship, I would assume. There's a lot more detail than in the background on the right side, specifically the right top. You can see there's some sort of buildings, some smoke, chimneys, etc., but they're very sort of foggy, hazy in the distance, so it makes them look like they're pushed back further in the distance. So this is where value, the colors are a little bit more washed out. Detail, there's a lot less detail. So we have more detail, more effectively vibrant colors, more value variations than here. The value is more washed out. There's less detail, so that sort of also pushes our perspective back into the distance. You can work with multiple perspectives as well. It's been used for centuries, a lot of times to show many different views of the same subject. So think about, like, it's not necessarily multiple perspectives, but different views of the same subject. Like we have a flat global map, right? You guys have seen where it's effectively a globe and the print is a little bit curved, but you're looking at, like, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously. We won't get into a whole flat earth discussion, but so you have a flat, you have an object around a spherical object that we're making into a flat object, right, to look at. You're going to be looking at that. That's technically, you're looking at a globe in multiple perspectives if you're looking at a flat global map. It's been around, like I said, for centuries. If you think of like old Egyptian art, often showing you different depictions or different parts of the same subject. So like in this case, we'll get into it a little bit later. So it can be like narrative structures. This could be various points in a singular narrative, just shown different ways. So if you think about like frames of a movie overlapping, kind of, I'm not quite sure. I don't have the details of this image, but you can see obviously there's various different perspectives here. We have a larger figure where like all of these figures are not standing together. They're different perspectives of potentially the same person or potentially the same story. It also happens we've talked about cubism a little bit earlier with our line work, but it also happens with cubism where effectively it's kind of like that globe spherical thing, showing a three-dimensional object in a flat plane and trying to show multiple perspectives of a three-dimensional object in a flat plane. I should switch it up and do a new descending, or descending, I always forget, a staircase, Duchamp piece, where effectively it's kind of both. It's one sort of narrative, a woman, we'll say descending, I always forget which one it is. She's coming down a staircase, so it's showing you all of the ways the body turns as you take a step, the various different perspectives of how that body would come down the stairs, but it's showing it in one flat plane. So it's showing you in a similar way to this, it's showing you like multiple perspectives. So again, think of flattening that 3D object into one visual plane. Amplified, can't talk today, amplified perspective is similar. It's technically different, but I sort of interchange amplified perspective and forced perspective. So forced perspective is something like this, to where it's showing you, we are somewhat familiar with a giraffe's nose is sort of rather long, or think about it like with a dog that has sort of a longer snout, and sort of showing that perspective by really coming in close up on the nose. And then as you can see, as it drops back, even though it's not that far, the eyes and the ears and the other details are out of focus and drop way back. So you get that forced perspective. They'll do forced perspective where it's technically different. A forced perspective thing is when, sort of simplified example of that is when you try to I'm sure you guys have all seen this, somebody trying to take a picture of like, there's an awesome moon out or whatever, and it's really low, so you have a friend like pose, it looks like they're grabbing the moon kind of thing. That would be a forced perspective. Technically not amplified perspective, but Amplified perspective, I feel like leans a little bit more towards like foreshortening. Again, we talked about that a little bit with our line work. So if you think about like foreshortening being if you're looking at a person laying down and you're almost directly in front of their feet. So obviously, like as you look back towards their head, their body as you go towards the head is essentially going to do a similar thing, like where let's say the feet would be more in focus. You have that more forced perspective or elongating perspective. Open form, these sort of go more towards static versus dynamic layouts, and this is something that we'll come back to a lot. But it can also deal with perspective, right? Again, we have multiple things going on in this image. We have the 3 pairs. There's some overlapping happening here, but having some parts of the objects extend beyond the frame, we are kind of familiar with what a pear looks like, or a fruit, or even we sort of know what these objects look like. You can see it, even though the bottom part of this pear drops off to the right of the frame, we can see a whole pear here, so we know what it looks like, even if we're not familiar with this fruit. So we can imagine, like, our minds sort of complete that picture and complete this pear breaking beyond the plane of the frame of the boundaries. It also sort of lends itself to be a little bit more of a dynamic layout. So when we talk about, which I'll mention frequently, we talk about static versus dynamic layouts. This would be more of a dynamic layout, right? There, for those of you guys that are taking photography or heard about it in other classes, we'll talk about it a bunch as well. Rule of thirds, essentially trying to keep in mind working in thirds. So if you broke up this image into the rule of thirds, you would effectively have like an imaginary line here, an imaginary line here, give or take. So you'd have this bottom third, the middle third, and the top third. And framing your photos, like, let's say for argument's sake, a closed form, a closed composition tends to be a little bit more static, right? This is also not necessarily going along with the rule of thirds, right? You're just kind of like centering your subject within the frame. It sort of gets the viewer to focus on the subject matter within the boundaries, doesn't really get the viewer to sort of think beyond the boundaries, but it's a little bit more of a static, and you can read that as boring, closed form composition, right? So this will be a little bit more dynamic, right? I've talked about a bunch throughout the semester already about leading the viewer's eye through a piece, right? And that can enhance or be enhanced with playing with these types of ideas with perspective, right? And with space. So this, your eye is moving around this image a lot more, right? So again, since we have just about 2/3 of the image fairly open, and then we have the bulk of the subject matter being in the bottom third, in one of the thirds, right? So breaking it up into the rule of thirds. But we also have a couple of all the objects falling off or breaking the plane of the boundaries, right? So it automatically sort of having this open space here draws the viewer's eye down, and then you have these 2 overlapping images. In theory, your eye could come down from this pair to this pair, leading you down and to the right, and then over to this pair, and then the way this pair points, going back to our shapes and how shapes have different directions. Since this one sort of goes larger to smaller, right to left, it kind of leads our eye back to right or left. So you almost kind of get this cyclical pattern, however you start it, but you almost get this sort of cyclical kind of figure 8 pattern, right, that the viewer can be led through, right? Not so much with a more closed composition, right? It creates a more static, there's not really anywhere for the eye to go. I mean, maybe with a little bit of space here at the top, your eye gets dropped down to the bottom a little bit, but generally the subjects, they're dead center, right in the middle of this frame, right? So it's a little bit less dynamic. It's more of a static composition. Also having a static composition doesn't necessarily emphasize space or perspective as well as this one, right? So opened and closed form compositions, static versus dynamic compositions, can also enhance perspective and space. And then lastly, this is sort of like an art nerd joke, but so this William Hogarth print, this is his satire on false perspective. So basically the quote, he says, whoever makes a design without the knowledge of perspective will be liable to such absurdities as are shown in this frontispiece. Basically, he's saying that if you don't understand perspective, then any image you create will be absurd, right? So if you look at this, you can't tell where the perspective is at all, right? And this is done obviously with an intent to sort of like, you have this hillside in the background. If we're thinking about the perspective rules, you have this hillside, which theoretically should be in the background with all these overlapping images and all this fun stuff in the building. And then you have this woman leaning out of a window, potentially talking to this guy who's supposedly in the background, but somehow they're the same.
It looks like she's lighting a pipe.
Yeah, exactly. But somehow they're about the same size, which obviously shouldn't be. But then, you have the way this guy's fishing here and the way the sign drops
That crow.
back down. Yeah, the crow, it would be a huge, huge crow. That would be like a giant crow, something out of a horror movie. But anyway, you can kind of see, if you look at the more you look at this image, the more you see how the perspective makes zero sense whatsoever. And that was his intent with this piece, to show that, like, if you don't have an understanding of perspective and you try to use it, your image will come out a little bit absurdist. Again, there's a whole bunch of things going on in this piece, but it was a relatively interesting piece to end on with starting to talk about and starting to plan spaces or pieces dealing with perspective.